Welcome to episode number 25 of the Detour 365 podcast. This is William, the host, and I will be joined by Bill and Nathaniel this evening as we continue our discussion from last week on the relationship of God with Enoch and also introducing God's relationship with Noah. This is a part 2 of last week's discussion, but it could also serve as a standalone. We will be summarizing some of what we mentioned last week in this week's podcast, but I would encourage you, if you're interested, to check out last week's episode. We will be looking at Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 12, and also some sections of the book of Enoch. Now, we hope you enjoy this episode and also this series. There's a lot of great content ahead as we continue with this Humanity of God series. So that is all for now, and we will begin episode number 25. So we are continuing with our discussion of God's dealings with Enoch, and then now Noah is entering the picture here. So this is kind of a part 2 of what we looked at last week. So if you're just listening to this today, check out part 1. And we're in this Humanity of God series, and we're looking at how God is clearly pleased with the two individuals that we're going to be talking about, Enoch and Noah, and takes into account their circumstances, and I'll explain what I mean by that later on, but their generation. It says they're righteous in their generation, as we'll see in the passages we're looking at, and also how God relates to them in kind of a human way, because that's the only way that they could really walk with God, as it says in these passages, for both of them, actually, for Noah and for Enoch. And also it's clear as we get into Genesis chapter 6 that God shows some sort of grief, regret. It says regret, and we'll talk about that more next time, but we will be mentioning it this time, that God shows emotion at the state of the earth and how things have kind of gone astray, gotten, corrupt. Humanity is corrupted. And we'll go into why this is, but that'll be kind of a major topic for next week, but it is something we will mention this week. So Genesis 5:24, which we looked at last time, says, Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. And then, so now we're looking at Genesis 6, 1 through 12, and Nathaniel's reading that from the, which version?
NIV.
All right.
Okay. Wickedness in the world. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race that I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground. For I regret that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. next section is Noah and the flood, which starts with...
Yeah, we can read a few verses of that.
9.
Yeah.
This is the account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. So God said to Noah, I am going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth.
Very good. Ending there on a positive note, right? So there is a backstory to all this in the book of Enoch, and there's a lot of parallels, of course. And we did mention that it says of Noah that he also walked with God. So I think that's kind of important to keep in mind. And there's a connection between Enoch and Noah, the events in the book of Enoch. Of course, we're not we are looking at the book of Enoch some, but this isn't necessarily all based on the account in Genesis, but also Enoch is a good resource, of course. We kind of went into that last time. There's a debate over whether we should look at it or not, but it is recognized in at least the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, or one of them. And it does give us a bit of a backstory to Genesis 6. So let me read a section of that. It's hard to read a section of the book of Enoch because it's very long, and it's interesting, but it does have a lot of... Have you taken a look at it, Nathaniel, the book of Enoch? I know you said you were going to read it in a day or something, right?
I've taken a look at it. I haven't read the whole thing.
You didn't read that?
But I've read the portion that this seems to overlap. Recognized that as I read this. Saw that it was a bit nicer, shall I say, in the way it presented things, I think.
Yeah. It definitely gives more detail as to some of the events.
This version from the NIV here, at least, kind of it's like a summary, I think, but it also kind of makes the angels coming down and picking human women a little bit less makes it sound more biblical standard, kind of nice phrasing.
Yeah, and that is the theory as to why the book of Enoch has kind of been pushed to the side, because it is very... It has a lot of things in it that are very intense. The Bible is intense, but it does talk about the angels, these watchers, fornicating with the women, and it goes into more detail as to all the stuff they did and what they taught people. And so it could be that I wasn't there when the decision was made as to why, anyway. So see what's up?
Enoch sounds more like something you encounter in a I don't know, some sort of mythology or something.
It is definitely very detailed, and I'll read this little section and see, because this kind of parallels some of the stuff we just read in Genesis 6. So this section's called Fallen Angels, and I think it's in the 3rd chapter of Enoch. And the way people divide the chapters... anyway, it's in the book of Enoch, at least the translation I got, so hopefully it's accurate. So it came to pass when the children of men had multiplied in those days, had multiplied that in those days, were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of heaven, saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, Come, let us choose wives from among the children of men, and beget us children. Then Simjaza, who was their leader, said unto them, I fear ye will not indeed agree to do this deed, for I alone shall have to pay the penalty of the great sin. And they all answered him and said, Let us all swear an oath and bind ourselves by mutual imprecations to not abandon this plan, but to do this thing. And they sware they all together and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. And they were... What's that?
I just wanted to... I'm sorry for interrupting there.
Yeah.
It just sounds like they're kind of saying, like, well, they can't punish all of us.
Yeah. It is kind of it doesn't work out well for them, I'll say that. Yeah. Well, I guess it's like, well, I alone don't want to suffer for doing this, or they can't punish all. Maybe that's what it does kind of sound like a mutiny, or, like if you're on a ship and like one person tries to mutiny, they, get probably executed, but, they probably get flogged or something. I don't know what they do in the Navy, but that's...
Yeah, flogging.
Flogging? Okay. Yeah. Let's see, let's see, we read that. Bind ourselves by mutual imprecations to not abandon this plan, but to do this thing. So they swear they, it's worded weirdly, then swear they all together and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. And they were in all 200, who descended in the days of Jared to the summit of Mount Hermon. And they called it Mount Hermon because they had sworn and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. So it goes through the next verse goes through their names, the 10 chieftains, and then the next verse, 7, says, And all others together with them took unto themselves wives, and they each chose for himself one, and they began to go into them and to defile themselves with them. And they taught them charms and enchantments, the cutting of roots, and made them acquainted with plants. So then they became pregnant, and they bare great giants whose height was 3,000 ells, who consumed all the acquisitions of men. Then when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. And they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and drink the blood, and the earth was laid accusation against the lawless ones. Then we get into like the different fallen angels and what they taught the people. They taught humans, and this is an important thing to what we're going to be talking about. It's not just stuff I'm mentioning because it's kind of interesting, but Azazel. So Azazel was one of the names of the angels that were given here. Taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates, and made known to them the metals of the earth and the art of working them, bracelets and ornaments, antimony, and the beautifying of the eyelids, and all kinds of costly stones, and coloring tinctures. And there arose much godlessness, and they committed fornication, and they were led astray and became corrupt in their ways. So Semjaza taught them root cutting, Emeros resolving of enchantments, Baraquidal taught astrology, Kokabel taught constellations, Ezekiel the knowledge of the clouds, so I guess weather, meteorology, Araquiel the signs of the earth, and Shamsiel the signs of the sun, and Sariel the course of the moon. So then it says, and as men perished, they cried, and their cry went up to heaven. So then that kind of gets things started there. So we see that the events that preceded the flood start with these watchers, these fallen angels that rebel against God. They procreate with human women. These women give birth to these like monstrosities, and then they taught the humans what the Book of Enoch. What's that?
Maybe this is a stupid question, but these fallen angels, they're not the same fallen angels that is like the source of Satan's cohorts or whatever, right?
I think they are. I think they're part of they're at least on the same side. I don't think it mentions Satan or Lucifer in the Book of Enoch, but it's definitely...
I mean, it's the only other time I've heard of these fallen angel things.
Yeah, that is an interesting question, because we do have Jesus mentioning, I saw Satan fall like lightning. So Satan did lead a rebellion, so I don't know if it's the same rebellion that this is, or if it's a different one. The case could be made for both.
Just the fact of there being more than one possible rebellion is interesting.
Yeah. Well, clearly, the devil or Satan, was present in the garden at the beginning. And he was not, he was already rebelling against God because he was trying to get the humans to, eat the forbidden fruit and all that business.
Yeah. And the garden was pre-Noah, obviously.
Yeah, and then after that, it does seem like things were... things were not as good as they were, but it seems like after these... They taught the humans what's called the lesser secrets. It refers to these as the lesser secrets later on in the Book of Enoch, but, the making of metal weapons and, like, all this tech... it seems like when all this tech gets introduced, it, like, kind of accelerates this decline and corruption. That before that, humans were kind of not innocent, but, it was their ability to do damage was kind of limited, it seems, before they got all this other stuff. Yeah.
And maybe we're still on a tangent from what you were originally saying when I pretty much interrupted you. But what I wrote down here was that it seems like what it's saying is when those kind of fallen angels or whatnot, though I guess I don't know if you want to call them fallen at that point, but as the, let's say, story goes, they started teaching like science and technology to humans, and it led to godlessness, essentially.
Yeah.
I think I made a similar observation last time, but just kind of how early they recognized that, like, I don't know, they saw technology and science and logical explanations replacing things that were sources of belief, I guess, or things like that.
I think this might also be a good example of this. Definitely you could kind of see in the making of weapons, though. You could definitely see how they...
But I guess it kind of would lead humanity to feel like, oh, hey, we're not just, like, passive, like, users, like, receivers of whatever was given to us.
Yeah.
By a god on the earth, but, like, they're actually like, oh, we're actually part of this and we can shape reality ourselves.
Yeah.
I think that realization would be something powerful.
Well,
possibly. kind of leading towards a godlessness kind of
thing. It would be a good thing if the humans were given wisdom along with because it does seem like these angels, and I'll mention this too, that they gave the humans this tech that they weren't really authorized to give them, and it could be that God would eventually introduce it. Not saying give them weapons, They
weren't following the Prime Directive.
Yeah, they weren't following the yeah. That's a good Star Trek reference there. Yeah, and so we'll kind of see that the fallen angels took what their sin was. They took what they shouldn't have had. They weren't given wives, as it says in the book of Enoch. They weren't given wives on purpose because they were of, they were of heaven and they didn't need wives. But humans were given, men were given, humans were given this arrangement. But then the secrets were not given to humans. They were given to these beings, And then the humans got the secrets they weren't supposed to have and they got the bad ones too, that they, as it implies, the secrets that were kind of like, knowledge, but not really with any kind of wisdom of how to use it. Not any wisdom from God of how to apply this. They learned how to make metal weapons. They learned how to artificially enhance beauty and predict the signs and the seasons and all that, but they didn't really. Yeah. So
it is interesting that it's named as that it's not called just that the source of that knowledge and stuff is not named just as some sort of divine inspiration, but it's attributed to creatures that a single group of outside entities.
Yeah, they were in possession of it, and they were given. I mean, if you're looking at the Book of Enoch, for example, these fallen angels, the secrets they were given, or the knowledge they were given, ends up, at least as it says later on in the book, it's God tells them, well, I didn't even give you the good stuff, you basically they had some angel knowledge, but they didn't have the best, and they were kind of, I don't know, prideful maybe or something, but
maybe it's just groups of aliens going around the galaxy giving the most basic knowledge possible that starts civilization happening.
Well, and I think that's why a lot of people are interested in the Book of Enoch, especially today, because there's a lot in there that sounds very
although it doesn't say they gave farming knowledge, right?
Well, they were taught about plants and roots and different things,
Yeah.
So,
well, that sounds more like the origin of witches to me, though.
And they were taught about metals, so they could have learned about metals for plows. They could have learned about metals for building other implements besides weapons.
Yeah, less sweat of your brow, more food. Not necessarily a bad thing. So what was the result? The result was from the pregnancies. The result were the monstrosities that the Nephilim, who kind of wrought havoc. I guess that's the right tense of the verb. They wrought havoc. They didn't wreak havoc. Maybe they wreaked havoc. But
which enabled the more basic fears and urges of humans to accelerate.
Yeah. Well, and then that's kind of what happened too. Is the result was this kind of acceleration into war and corruption, and then the result of that, the first result was God's judgment on these watchers, or the fallen angels. They're referred to as the watchers in the book of Enoch, which is interesting. I'd like to find out why they're called the watchers. I feel like there's a significance to that, but someone who's listening here probably knows the answer to that question. But
also that brings to mind the biblical-ish description of angels, right? Like something covered in a bunch of eyeballs or something.
Yeah, well, that's true. That's true. There are certain classes of them that are described that way. And, whether that has a lot of symbolism on its own, but also that's an interesting rabbit hole to go down, for sure. So as far as, I did want to jump really quick to the humans, though, because we're not entirely innocent in this story, even though the Watchers did kind of initiate what was happening here. The humans desired to receive the knowledge, and they were glad to receive this technology, kind of no questions asked. They kind of received it, they put it to use, and quickly they put it to use not for good, but they put it to use for like their own destruction. And that's kind of interesting. And the result was like everything was kind of starting to become corrupt, and then we get God's judgment on the humans and this kind of desire that we see to kind of wipe the slate clean, which is known as the flood. And Noah is mentioned in the book of Enoch, so this is mentioned that Noah was forewarned and that he was set apart as well. So just real quick, two or more than two, but the similarities between Enoch and Noah. They were both able to walk with God, as it says. They were both considered righteous in their generation. They stood out from the rest, and they were set apart. So that kind of is like, righteous in their generation. They stood out, according to God, they stood out from the rest, and they were set apart. It's interesting that Enoch's flesh did not see corruption, because he was taken up, as it says. He just kind of disappeared. He doesn't physically die. He was just kind of taken up, abducted, it seems. However, Noah was, with the case of Noah, there's all this talk about the corruption of the earth and the corruption of the flesh on the earth, and Noah's saved from that. So there's kind of a weird, and it might just be the word the translators use, but I just kind of noticed that word corruption, and having to do with decay, and the fact that Enoch didn't experience it for himself, and that Noah didn't experience really. Well, Noah saw the decay that was around him, but he was saved from the consequences of it. Both were forewarned and given information. Enoch was sent. If you look at the book of Enoch, God sends him to the fallen angels. That's kind of amusing, because you have this man that's going and kind of pronouncing judgment, God's judgment on these beings that, as we look at the way that the fallen angels thought of the humans, they kind of thought we were lesser creatures, which I guess Paul in his letter, right, he says, we're a little lower than the angels. Is that in Paul's letters? Or I think it's in one of Paul. We're a little lower than the angels, so God sends this human man to the fallen angels to deliver the sentence. And Enoch's given a lot of kind of foreknowledge of events that are to come. Noah was given foreknowledge about the destruction, the flood. He was sent to build the ark, to save a remnant from God's judgment. And so, I guess kind of one of the questions is, how were these two, and I don't know if we kind of answered this last time, sort of, but like, why were these two considered righteous? Because obviously Noah and Enoch were humans, and humans, even the best of them, are not perfect. They have sinned at some point, and that's true of everybody, and everybody in the Old Testament. It seems like
because the lack of an ability to attain perfection does not remove from you the necessity of
right,
like giving up, or like not giving up, or like not. It doesn't allow you to stop trying.
Well, I agree. I mean, the answer in the New Testament side of things is kind of easy, because we have God's work through Jesus, so we're forgiven of our sins, and God can look past our imperfections, and but the whole idea of God can't tolerate any kind of presence of sin or imperfection. At least that was what was preached to me in some instances. God doesn't tolerate any kind of sin or anything. So
right.
I often wonder when we look at the Old Testament and these guys. What's that?
I think because they really loved God.
Yeah, I mean like David, and
the quality of their love of God surpassed that of other people.
Yeah.
Isn't that? I feel like that'd be difficult to quantify. I don't know. Maybe that.
Well, I don't.
The importance of what, because I know you've.
I don't dispute that, but I have to focus on that, because what we're God really focuses on David's heart.
Yeah.
He when we look at Enoch, and Enoch walked with God, and he wasn't anymore. He just walked off with God. And the only thing that I have been able to figure out in my years is that they just really loved God more than other people. And that's what made them unique. And there's a difference between, worship and, belief and loving God.
So that sounds like the difference between a belief motivated by fear of consequence.
Well, unfortunately, that session did end there. We will be back and continue on where we left off. So we're going to take a short break. We are back.
Yes.
Here.
Welcome. Okay, let me see this. For some reason, this. Okay. It's interesting that you mentioned David, because I'm going to mention him as an example here in a minute.
I've got about 15 minutes, by the way.
Okay, so I'll try to put this into a little package, and then we might unpack it a little more after you're gone, but...
Well, I don't know how your editing skills are, but I do recall the sentence I was saying.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, thing finished. I was saying that it sounded like it sounded like you were observing the difference between a faith based on the fear of consequences and a faith based on the love of God.
Absolutely.
Which I just thought was an interesting observation to make.
And I think that's really important. I guess there are a lot of people who are scared into heaven, but God wants us to love Him. And that's why we're given the Bible as we have it today, is so that we are able to establish a loving relationship with God.
So what does that say about human nature? The fact that, like, if the point of the Bible is to establish a relationship based on love for God, or a faith based on love for God, then in theory, you wouldn't even present the idea of hell, right?
Well, now it does. Now faith is an element of this because.
Well, I'm just saying it's sort of an admittance of that. It seems like probably most people base their whatever faith they have on both of those, or it's an expectation that just that one solution of lovey-dovey isn't going to work as a, I'll say, faith motivator.
Well, God gives us the entirety of Scripture to explain the universe, and that includes that God is a just God, and yes, He is and can be a wrathful God, and at the end of time, we see His wrath poured out on those who have transgressed against Him.
Yeah, well, speaking of that, and emotions, and William, I'll turn it back over to you in a second, but I just wanted to point out that, this whole series, which is, the humanity of God, which to me, my brain pays much attention to the fact that, like, emotions are a big part of the humanity of God and His displaying of them. And as far as I can tell, emotions are generated by external stimulus. As in, like, things that you don't know ahead of time. All right, now, I think I pointed this out before, maybe in a slightly different way, but if God is experiencing emotions based on stimulus that He wasn't expecting, what's going on there?
So we actually talked about this. There was a sermon today on the fact that Jesus wept at the grave of Lazarus. And, when we're talking about, I guess it's a little easier to see when we're talking about Jesus because he was fully God and fully man, but in certain cases he did not use his, he grieved as a human at the death of Lazarus. And, it says that he wept, not that he didn't know Lazarus. I mean, he knew Lazarus was going to die, and he knew that he was going to be raised from the dead as a miracle. But at that moment, he did grieve and weep over the situation. And, he even asked where Lazarus' tomb was, which, if he was using... There were instances where Jesus knew what people were thinking, and so there were instances where he used that side of him was outwardly manifest, and instances where the human side was outwardly manifest, I guess.
I don't think he was omniscient all the time. I don't think...
Well, he didn't draw on it, at least. Yeah. I believe in this series in the Old Testament. What's that?
It seems like Jesus, as the Bible goes, it seems like he needed to ask for greater than human knowledge, essentially from God. Sort of, didn't he pray and ask for guidance?
And he prayed and asked for the power to do the miracles that he did.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But he also, at the same time, when he was being tempted, he had the power to turn the rocks into loaves of bread if he wanted to, but yeah, that's it. Well, I guess if we get to the Old Testament side of things, there's definitely a component to God showing these human emotions, and at least to the people that are there. But then again, we are made in the image of God, and we show emotion. But it does seem like it's a way to relate. It's a way to relate to the humans that God is relating to. I mean, God, of course, is above time ultimately, but yeah, it is hard to kind of put it into a way that because I don't think we have the capacity to fully understand what it would be like to be God, so that is kind of a,
Yeah, it's also
I don't
overpowered answer, I would say.
I don't think that emotion has to be generated by some unknown event. There are, and
well, I mean,
I can't give you specific movies.
I mean, we all know that each other are going to die at some point, but I'd be pretty upset if y'all died.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah.
But there are movies that generate tears that make me melancholy and generate sorrowful feelings in me that I have seen multiple times.
Yes, and I think that quite obviously I'm sorry. I think that speaks more to humans' inability to perfectly and fully realize not just mortality, but I don't know, but whatever it is, when you're watching a movie, that suspension of disbelief, and I think there is some part of our brains that still just, we're not just made of, well, I started to say we're not just made of logic circuits. I kind of feel anyway, there's some part of our brain that just doesn't accept that we know exactly how things are going to play out. Even though it's a movie, I think that, there's still some part of us that we get emotionally invested in watching movies that we've seen before. But if you've seen it 100 times back to back, that feeling diminishes. Just speaks to humans being imperfect, I guess.
Well, I do see the fact that God shows emotion.
In God's case, that shouldn't hold true.
Well, to me at least to the humans in the story and reading the story, that when God shows emotion, that things happening in creation, things happening to individuals, whether it's Jesus weeping over Lazarus or God showing some sort of emotion to the faithfulness of people or otherwise. It does show that God is not far off and aloof and cut off from what is happening, even though God is above, even though God knows.
Yeah.
It's not that. I guess the emotion in the human side is kind of where the connection, which I think is important to why we should look at, and you, of course, were the one who suggested this series, so that and there are all these points to look at, where
I think
yeah.
I think that I think the conclusion to be drawn from asking the question of how much would we be able to relate to and or love a God which displayed no emotion and was thus actually what you might define as perfect, which there's a bit of depth to that claim there, I guess, but like a perfect machine or something would just be purely logical all the time, right? It'd just be add, subtract, or at least that's one definition of what perfection would look like. But how much could we relate to? I just want to get back to how much could people relate to and or love something which has no emotion or
Yeah. Well, I mean, even if you look at the example of Jesus clearing the temple, he definitely showed anger when he cleared the temple, but it was he was still fully loving at the same time that he was throwing the money changers out of the, so it was.
Yeah, and if you take you can people take anger counseling and stuff, right? And what do they tell you? Stuff like your response to. I have not taken anger counseling. I have anger counseling, but interject a gap between your reception of information and your reaction to it, essentially, right? Inferring that anger is a less than perfect reaction, even though I would say that it's more healthy to accept that you're angry instead of as long as you don't take overly negative action from that. But also anger's necessary a lot of times to get people to listen to you to some extent. So
yeah, I guess it's also if it's not balanced by, if it's not balanced by love and, if it's just, I think there is a difference in types of angers, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But, where were we?
I have to go in 2 minutes.
2 minutes, all right. Let me see. I did want to mention this while you were still here. I was listening recently to parts of Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, and it's a good book to... The audiobook's on YouTube if you ever want to listen to it. Gives a good outline of things. And I was kind of struck by there's a section in there where he mentions how God, we were talking about this a little bit with David, God saw David's heart and his inner, desire to know God, and even though David did make a lot of mistakes, and, more than just mistakes, but, this whole idea of, we see the outside, and we don't necessarily know the whole story with each individual. But God can see the circumstances, like the circumstances you grew up in, what you went through. There was an example of, let's say you have a phobia let's say if we're just talking about courage, and let's say you have a phobia, you're afraid of cats or something, and it shows great courage if you're afraid of cats to rescue somebody's cat out of a sewer or something. Just an example there, but it could also be great courage to take out an active shooter. You do something that might seem a little more like, wow, that took a lot of courage to do, but I don't know. God can see. Well, let me use the example, because I wrote down the example of the widow's mite and Jesus noticing that there was a poor widow who was people were putting money into the offerings for the temple, and there was some people were putting in a lot. They had a lot of money and they were putting in a lot, and the coins were making a lot of noise as they were going in, and people were making a big show out of what they were putting into the coffers or whatever. And then there was a widow that put in a little
taking selfies.
Taking selfies. And then there was a widow that just kind of quietly put in like a penny. And Jesus said, like, well, she gave more than everybody else. When you look at the whole, but on the surface it seemed like she didn't give much, but she actually gave more than everybody else because she gave everything that she had.
Yeah.
So it could be a situation with Enoch and Noah and many like them that, they're growing up and they're living in such corrupt times. And I'm sure they were, by our today's standards, they were, they were desiring to follow and walk with God. But it seems like even more so they stood out because of the times that they were in. Because it was such a awful time to be alive. I mean, I would like to be a fly on the wall to see it, but
I think it's important to maybe use that to point out the fact that, to me it's a fact, but it's illogical to apply today's standards to people or groups of people that were operating in the past, where the world was a different place.
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely. Well, I mean, they're definitely like absolutes, like don't murder. Murder is always a bad thing to do, but
yeah. Well, I mean, people do go to war.
But if you're like, let's say your whole family's your whole family is murderers, and you're not a murderer.
Yeah.
That's.
No, everything's super complex.
Yeah. So there is kind of that whole, like a sin is a sin, but at the same time, I do believe God notices our circumstances, and there are Christians that don't really do a whole lot. Maybe it doesn't seem like they do a whole lot, but they have to go through a lot, a lot of inner struggles that we don't see, So
yeah, and that complexity of what's right and wrong as per individual circumstances, what makes it true that you can't replace culture with laws.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly like like the moral laws in the Bible, but then also there are like cultural laws that are in there that
you can't replace values with laws.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
And on that note, I think I have to go.
Well, go forth and do your thing.
Enjoy.
Yes.
Have a good evening.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm sorry. I feel like I distracted you while simultaneously having a limited time myself.
Have a good evening.
Alrighty.
Yes. Peace.
Thank you. It's been enjoyable.
Peace be upon you.
Indeed. And you and your household.
We certainly need. No, we're fairly peaceful most of the time.
Just keep Jenny from visitors.
Yes, the dog, not Jenny's not a person.
Yes.
If you're listening to this, it's not a person we're locking up in the attic or something. Well, we don't have an attic anyway, but so yeah.
That's true.
Over
and out.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. So that was interesting. So I did have in my notes, God is not cold and far off, so that these displays of emotion definitely show us. What was deism invented in the 1700s? It was kind of an Age of Enlightenment thing that God was this like watchmaker that set the universe in motion and kind of went away. But that's definitely not the God we see in the Bible. God still deals with people, and people are messy. But that mess does not stick. God can still come down and join us in the mess, but not be tainted by the mess, if that
Right.
If that makes sense. So God, God has standards, and God is, so there is that tension of like God is sinless and perfect, and judges. But at the same time, God desires a relationship with us and seeks us out. So when you have individuals, and this is especially interesting in the Old Testament because the cross and the resurrection had yet to occur. And this is always kind of a question I have with the Old Testament, and I have a certain belief about it, but like the cross, the atonement for sin, and the resurrection of Jesus did not occur yet as far as our timeline, yet God formed relationships with Abraham and all these individuals,
But in one sense, the cross and the resurrection happened at the very beginning of time.
Yes. Yes, and that's what I think. That's what I believe as far as, God sees it, the cross and the resurrection. Since God is ultimately above time, but God also deals in time to deal with us, the cross and the resurrection had already happened. I might be getting myself into theological, there might be theologians listening to this that disagree, but
I don't think so. Well, that's something we can argue with theologians sometime, but I don't think that is problematic.
I mean, Moses didn't even, or not Moses, I'm not saying, Enoch and Noah didn't even have the law. I mean, the law of Moses didn't even exist then. And, they were just going off of desire to know what God wanted and to follow God. And that was kind of all they had, right? I mean,
right. They just loved God and wanted to have a relationship with Him.
Yeah.
And they strove to do that. And one thing we have to keep in mind here is however it works, in another study in which I've participated, it's one on Revelation, it has brought home to me how important it is that we remember the absolute holiness of God. God wants a relationship with us, but God is absolutely holy. So there must be a way that God has provided for us to become holy, if we are going to have a relationship with Him.
Yeah.
And I see that as through the cross of Christ.
Yep.
That it's the only mechanism that I can understand as providing that gateway. Jesus tells us that.
Yeah.
You only come to the Father but through me. But that means Enoch had to approach God through Jesus.
Yeah. Well, and we do know for sure that, since the Son, Jesus always existed, the Son, the Trinity of God always, just like, it's not, there's no perfect illustration for the Trinity. I mean, they're all, there's no perfect one, but I always understand it. They're not separate in that, you have...
They have never been separate.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Jesus was incarnated with the birth and, those 30 years he walked around on earth, but that's our perspective, our timeline that we're in. And, to God, it already happened in a way.
But he was human then.
Yeah, he was human, yeah.
We have to remember that. He was,
of course,
he wrapped in humanity at that time.
Well, that's the way it had to be, man.
And we have to remember that.
Yeah.
People want to give Jesus all sorts of God powers while he was human. And every time we see him doing something supernatural, he prays to the Father about it.
Well, and he did say, I mean, on numerous, he did say, what was it, when they came and arrested him, if I wanted to, I could, I could call upon the army of God and, I'd be freed, instantly, and it wouldn't, at any point he had the ability, he had the access to the power, but he didn't use the power. So I did want to touch on some quick lessons and applications before this. How much time do we have? Do we have 10 minutes, or what are you seeing there?
I have no clue.
Oh.
I don't have a timer.
Well, hopefully we can get a little prayer in at the end of this, and if there are any other thoughts, we can continue on next time. But we will be talking about Noah next week,
right?
Next Sunday, so that certainly can easily segue. As we are segueing, I guess this whole episode was kind of a segue, right? so segueing a segue. So lessons, kind of practical lessons and spiritual lessons for us here from this, what we've been talking about. God calls us to stand out in our generation, inwardly and outwardly. Stand out in a positive way, desire to follow God and to have a relationship with God and to live inwardly, and then also in our actions. And the outward stuff, like in Noah's example, it was building a giant ark, and it could be something like as outward as that, or it could be, Enoch doesn't really, Enoch didn't build an ark or do anything like that, but he had this kind of more inward, at least from what I see, inward walk with God, and he lived a righteous life, and he was, and then also remember that God is paying attention and knows, put us here for a reason, of course, and knows the times that we are living in, knows our circumstances, knows our heart, just like he knew David's heart, even when David was chosen to be king, and that whole story. And God is looking for faithful individuals to join in the work of the kingdom and divine purpose, and that's always happening. And the next one is that God will guide us and prepare us for what is to come. These individuals that were walking with God were given foreknowledge, and sometimes they took actions that would have been kind of head-scratching for people around. Like the whole thing with Noah, I guess whenever that story is portrayed, he's always kind of portrayed as like this, people thought he was a crazy guy building, it doesn't say that in the Bible, but, you imagine what people would have thought if he was building this giant thing. They would have thought he was crazy. But, these individuals were given foreknowledge of what is to come, and most of the people around, whether it was in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, whether it was in a lot of these stories, most people were not seeking to know God or seeking a relationship with God, but also they were, as a result, not clued in, to what was happening, and just kind of absorbed in the daily stuff. And so, seek God, seek first the kingdom, and don't be distracted by the stuff. I guess this kind of might sound a little vague. I'm just trying to sum it up kind of, not quickly, but in some way that's understandable. But if you have any questions, let me know. I'm sure listening to this again, I will be like, well, I should have mentioned this or that, but I think I will mention it next time if it comes up. So
there will be many questions pursued as we get into the whole Noah story next time.
Oh yes, and this whole series as well. So thanks for listening. If you made it this far, I congratulate you. And we will be talking about Noah next week, and the flood, and God's regrets, and all of that, which will be a big discussion. So have a good week or a good day, and we will be back.